How much food does it take to feed the world? Well, on average, people need at least 2,100 calories per day, and our worldwide food production is about 5,600 calories per person per day. So at the moment, we're definitely producing more than we need to feed everyone. Of course, our total global food production is not evenly distributed. Not everyone's nutrition needs are getting met, even with our highly connected, globalized trade. But in most parts of the developed world, we take it for granted that there's enough food in our grocery stores. We assume the sun will keep shining on essential crops like wheat, rice, soybeans, and potatoes, that electricity will continue to power the machinery, communications, and transportation required to produce and distribute our food. We are accustomed to an abundance of ingredients to satisfy our taste buds and meet nutritional needs. But can we be so sure of having constant sunlight, electricity, variety? It turns out there are big threats to our food supply. Nuclear war resulting in a nuclear winter, supervolcanic eruption, and asteroid impacts could partially or totally block our sun, causing temperatures to drop and preventing the growth of grains, vegetables, and other crops we rely on for food. Cyber attacks, electromagnetic pulses from nuclear weapons, and solar storms could cause large-scale crashes in our electricity network, threatening critical infrastructure for food production, manufacturing, transportation, and communications. Meanwhile, pandemics, crop disease, superweeds, pests, extreme weather events, extreme global warming, the death of essential microorganisms in the soil, death of pollinators like bees, or some combination of these threats could impact large swathes of agriculture around the world. How likely are these global catastrophes, and how big? We talked to Juan Garcia Martinez from ALLFED, the Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters.
The mission of ALLFED can be summarized as increasing resilience against global catastrophic food shocks. The way it came to be is, in 2014, Dave Denkenberger and Joshua Pierce wrote the book Feeding Everyone No Matter What, looking at ways to counteract the loss of global food production in case of sunlight reduction scenarios such as a nuclear winter.
Denkenberger and Turchin, 2018, have proposed a color-coding system to evaluate and compare global risks. We're talking threats that have a smallish probability, but are a big deal if they do happen. We're talking catastrophes that could lead to human and animal extinction, or wipe out at least 1 billion people. Global catastrophes that tend to escape the attention of governments who are more interested in local, immediate risks and in winning the public vote. Indeed, public awareness, what issues you care about, can truly affect what governments care about. Some of these large-scale risks are neglected because they don't seem to pose an immediate threat. We haven't yet experienced a full-scale nuclear war, so it doesn't tend to be on our radar. Governments have preparedness and response plans for more frequent, local, and predictable risks, like fires and floods. But global catastrophic risks with potential to wipe out humanity or cause mass starvation? That's someone else's problem, surely. And humanity's never been wiped out before, so why worry? ALLFED estimates that the probability of a near-total loss of electricity would be about 10% within the coming century, taking into account all major threats like a large-scale cyber attack, solar storms, extreme pandemics, and high-altitude electromagnetic pulses from nuclear weapons. The chance of a 10% loss of electricity would be about 30%. Meanwhile, the probability of abrupt sunlight reduction that would cause more than 30% loss of agriculture is, according to ALLFED, about 10% per century. And they reckon the likelihood of a 10% loss of agriculture, which would still be really bad, is about 90% this century. So what does this mean for our food supply? According to Xia and others in 2021, a full-scale nuclear war could release 150 teragrams of soot into the stratosphere, and in this worst case, some 75% of the world population could starve to death. Martinez and others say that many global catastrophic risks could hamper conventional agriculture for 5 to 10 years. Sure, we still have some food stored up, which we could use for a while, but experts say it would only last a few months.
I've seen estimations ranging from 3 months to 9 months, It depends on many different factors, but that's roughly the amount.
So if food production is cut off by any of the threats mentioned earlier, the total amount of food we currently have in storage would only last a few months, and the crisis may well last 5 to 10 years. So what can we do about it? While it's mainly up to governments to develop preparedness and response plans and fund relevant research, there are other groups like ALLFED who are working on some promising solutions, and we think it's worth knowing a bit about this no matter who you are. After all, everyone needs to eat. It's time to dig into the juicy stuff. Promising ways to feed the world in times of crisis, and even right now among the millions of malnourished people who can't afford or access good nutritious food.
These resilient food solutions are a set of food adaptations that complement food conservation adaptations like redirecting food that is now used for animal feed or for biofuels towards human consumption, which will be fundamental in all of the different catastrophes that I've described in order to have enough food. So instead of conserving the production that's left, resilient food solutions allow you to increase production to cover the gap.
We need food solutions that are rapidly scalable and not too expensive, and ideally tasty. What's on the menu? I hope you like Japanese. Nutritious, highly scalable, and able to grow in low light and cold temperatures, seaweed is an incredible source of fiber and protein. Seaweed grows really fast. Some species of kelp grow 0.5 meter every day, and seaweed farming is also the fastest growing aquaculture sector right now, as more and more people realize how sustainable and scalable this food source is.
Even in a nuclear winter, the most extreme sunlight reduction scenario, seaweed could still be produced at an affordable cost and in significant quantities because, seaweed can grow even in low sunlight. You can find it very deep in the ocean.
And we wouldn't need any fancy tech to cultivate it. Basically just ropes, buoys, anchors, and boats, which we can quickly deploy. Funnily enough, the main limiting factor has to do with the ropes on which our seaweed would be grown. Even though we would likely have enough raw material, we have to twist a hell of a lot of synthetic fibers around each other in order to make the ropes, and we currently don't have enough rope twisters. If we do manage to twist enough rope, ALLFED estimates that seaweed could provide 160% of humanity's calorie needs within just 1 year. But even the seaweed lovers among us probably don't want to live off seaweed alone, partly because we might overdose on iodine. So what else is on the menu? Well, if we manage to build some decent greenhouses, we could actually grow quite a few of the crops we currently rely on, like corn, rice, and soybean, enough to provide about 1/5 of worldwide calorie needs within a year. Outdoor growing will be tougher when the sun is obscured and temperatures drop, but greenhouses would at least keep our green babies nice and warm. It's a low-tech solution too. All we really need are some thin polymer sheets nailed to wooden frames, though we would need to ramp up our current production rate for extruding those plastic sheets. Okay, so we've said that outdoor growing will be tougher in situations of lower sunlight and warmth, but regions that are currently hot, like the tropics, might still be warm and bright enough for certain crops.
For example, moving wheat, potatoes, and other cool-tolerant crops from other locations where they are cultivated now towards the equator, and particularly south of the equator, which is where they will be able to be grown best after a nuclear winter or volcanic winter scenario.
If countries are able to cooperate with each other, we could grow these cold-tolerant, high-yield crops to get a good balance of macronutrients. Potatoes and sugar beets produce a substantial amount of calories per hectare. Rapeseed produces a good amount of fat, and wheat produces a high amount of protein per hectare. If all goes well, we could meet half of our global calorie needs within a year. Note that this is not equivalent to half of what we currently produce, because we're currently producing way more than enough to feed the world, and there might be some extra challenges in terms of transport and distribution in times of crisis. More on this later. Mushrooms would be a tasty and plentiful food source with a very high ramp rate. That is, we could rapidly grow heaps because each mushroom produces billions of spores, and there would be plenty of dead tree logs to grow them on. Moreover, mushrooms break down the wood they're growing on, and this decomposed wood can be fed to cattle, sheep, bison, and, if we turn it into sugar, as I'll explain later, even us. And of course, another superpower is that many mushrooms grow in the dark, so conditions of reduced sunlight would not be a problem. The next dish may seem weird at first, but microbial protein is actually not new. Yeast, miso, and spirulina are all formed in a similar way, in a process known as biomass fermentation. The basic idea is, we got some microorganisms milling around in this container of liquid, and we feed it with certain organic matter like sugars or gases like nitrogen and oxygen. At the right temperature, protein-rich microorganisms rapidly reproduce until we have a solid amount of edible food that's 50 to 80% protein based on dry mass. Red meat and chicken contain similar amounts of protein, and with microbial protein, no animal gets harmed. For both moral and affordability reasons, it's probably really worth investing in this food source. Even if there's a relatively high upfront cost compared to maintaining our current factory farms and slaughterhouses, the investment is likely to pay off.
This is already being done at industrial scale. This year, the first methane-based single-cell protein will enter production in industrial levels of over 10,000 tons per year.
But protein doesn't need to be factory grown or factory farmed. If the sun is blocked, trees will die, and we'll have a hell of a lot of dead leaves on our hands. Provided they're not toxic, leaves can be ground up and squeezed to extract leaf juice. When you heat the extracted liquid, leaf protein concentrate, or LPC, rises to the surface. LPC is a nutrient-dense food source with a texture similar to cheese or tofu. It has a slightly bitter, grassy flavour, but I'm sure it can be flavoured up with spices and your favourite marinade. And similar to microbial protein, it has great potential to bridge nutritional deficits now, as well as during food system shocks. How might we flavour up our protein? In a process called microbial electrosynthesis, we can produce vinegar just by combining special microbes with electricity and carbon dioxide. Maybe this is one of the foods that won't be possible in disasters that cut off our electricity, but at least for threats affecting agriculture, it's potentially a win. And what about sweets? So far we've only seen savoury food solutions. Well, we have plenty of wood and other biomass, especially if the sun is blocked and trees die, and it turns out that wood is full of cellulose which can be turned into sugar under the right conditions. The human digestive system can't normally break down chunky, hard pieces of wood, but when you grind it up and apply enzymes, say from mushrooms, which are rather good at digesting or decomposing things, you can make a decent amount of sugar. Paper milling factories are already accustomed to pulverizing wood on a large scale, so we could start there to speed up the process. It would cost just $1 to produce enough calories for one person per day, and we could feed about 20% of the world population within a year. Of course, we probably shouldn't live off sugar alone, so what else? Animal feed might not be your first pick when browsing a restaurant menu normally, but it's actually often made of ingredients that are edible to humans. For example, soybean, oats, and corn, also known as maize, like in tortillas. Meanwhile, animals such as cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs are very capable of consuming things we can't digest, like cereal stalks and raw tree leaves. So, if we switch farm animals over to eating this fibrous plant matter, this would free up a lot of food for humans, over 1,700 calories of animal feed per person each day. The International Energy Agency predicts that we'll produce over 180 billion litres of biofuel annually for the next few years. Biofuel is an alternative fuel source for transport, heating, and electricity, made of plant matter rather than coal, solar energy, nuclear power, and so on. Some of the plant matter we currently use for biofuel is very much edible, like corn, soybeans, and sugar. In a food supply crisis, we would want to repurpose those ingredients to feed a starving population. But what about dairy, meat, and seafood? Would we have enough to feed cattle, chickens, pigs, and sheep? And would marine life be affected by agriculture losses on land? Even if we're eating their soybeans, oats, and other animal feed ingredients, some farm animals could eat the fibrous plant matter we can't consume. And even in a nuclear winter, we would potentially have enough light to grow grasses and fodder crops. Marine life might even proliferate where temperatures dip and cool the upper layer of our oceans, causing an upwelling of nutrient-rich water from the deep. But Scherer and others in 2020 say cold temperatures and reduced sunlight would greatly decrease fish biomass, such that agricultural losses could not be offset by the world's fisheries, especially given widespread overfishing. As demand increases, we'd likely see a surge in factory farming and fishing, and prices will soar. ALLFED has modelled how things would look if we only rely on our current food sources in a nuclear winter. Outdoor crop production, the green region, is by far the biggest source of food for us currently. You can see how it dwarfs meat production in red, while dairy and fish are barely visible, and crop production would plummet in a crisis. But we can greatly bolster our supply with greenhouse crops, microbial protein, seaweed, cellulosic sugar, and so on if we think carefully about resource distribution. ALLFED's model suggests that at the lowest point of a crisis, we would only meet 30% of protein, fat, and calorie needs if we continue on as normal. But by deploying these other methods, we would continually meet at least 147% of our needs throughout the crisis. That said, all of this assumes robust global trade, and can we really be sure of that? For a start, as we saw earlier, critical infrastructure could be disrupted for years in a crisis, blocking the transportation of seeds and fertilizer and making it even harder to distribute food to people in need. But also, in a world where billions are at risk of starvation, resource competition, hoarding, conflict, and food riots may blind us from recognizing that it is technically feasible to feed everyone with plenty to spare. Within each nation's government, the apparent pressure to reassure local populations may lead to export bans, as we have seen with smaller food crises, such as in 2022 following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and early in 2020 under the threat of COVID-19. In a global trade market that relies on India for rice, Russia for wheat, and China for polymer sheets, how do we improve global trade, especially in a crisis that affects transport and communications?
Well, throughout history, export bans have been repeatedly put in place in crises, and they've invariably made things worse. Now, it's possible to feed everyone. We can implement the systems to make it happen, and it's much easier to do it if trade remains. Our hope is that awareness of this fact will incentivize governments to do the right thing.
So what can we do now to mitigate the risk and prepare?
Things that governmental organizations can do to prepare today could include establish contingency planning, like they do for other risks like tsunamis, fires, or floods, targeted research and development investments, like rapid construction pilots and deployment pilots, sometimes legislative change, more proactive risk assessment, like the US is doing with the Global Catastrophic Risk Mitigation Act, and more foresight, including horizon scanning, forecasting, and red teaming.
Recapping what we've covered in this video, our first key takeaway is there are major threats to our food supply. Natural and human-made disasters that could block our sun and stunt agricultural production or disrupt critical infrastructure. The amount of food we currently have in storage is nowhere near enough to last us through such crises. But our second takeaway is there are lots of nourishing, cheap, and rapidly scalable food solutions we could deploy. There's no need to panic if the worst happens, no need to war with other countries or steal from our neighbours or drag up every fish from the sea. Even now, there is low-hanging fruit to feed the millions of people experiencing food insecurity. We can produce substantial amounts of microbial protein, leaf protein, sugar, build greenhouses, relocate crops to the tropics, repurpose animal feed and biofuel, harvest seaweed and mushrooms, and still continue some dairy, meat, and seafood if we smartly prioritize and share our resources across the globe. But how do we enable this abundant food to reach those who need it most? How do we maintain global trade, especially in a crisis that affects transport and communications? How do we strengthen our supply such that no one relies on a single country for a given resource? These are huge questions beyond the scope of this video, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section. In my opinion, the first step is to care enough. How many of us recognize the arbitrary lines that determine whether you're born in a country with plenty of natural resources or one with hardly any? How much are rich countries willing to give to ensure basic human rights for everyone? Maybe if we care a little more about fellow humans beyond our immediate environment, governments would care more too, and we would all have enough to eat.